Okay, for our next project we're going to wax the upper left first molar, number 14. So as usual, the first step is we're going to put a little bit of separator on the die. Make sure it's not too much. So that it doesn't come off easily while we're waxing. So as usual, we're going to put a layer of wax called a wax coping over the die. Now when you guys wax for crown and bridge, it will be a little bit different because you're going to put more of the separator on it. Since these are plastic dies, as soon as you put the separator on it, it will stay on and the wax will not stick to it for a long time, so the wax will keep falling off. That's why I have you guys wipe it off and just leave a very thin coat over it. On stone dies it's a little different because you have to put more separator on and you will have to apply it every once in a while to keep the wax from sticking to it because it's a different material. Okay, so now, as we learned before, we will push this die down all the way, make sure it seats and the margins are below the gums. This is an upper first molar, so we have 4 cusps and 1 small vestigial cusp that isn't being used, and it's called the cusp of Carabelli. The cusp of Carabelli is only located on the upper first molars. So if we remember our anatomical structures, we have 4 cusps plus the cusp of Carabelli on the first molar. We have the mesiobuccal cusp, the distobuccal cusp, the mesiolingual cusp, and the distolingual cusp, named for their locations. The mesiobuccal, distobuccal, mesiolingual, distolingual. So, our first cusp we're going to put on is the mesiobuccal cusp. And we have to recognize that the molars on the maxillary arch, they have the shape of a rhombus. the shape of a rhombus is like a distorted rectangle. So the rectangle is parallel on all sides, but it's twisted towards the mesial. So if you see it here, this line is not like this, but it goes this way. So that's a rhombus. If you take this box, for instance, and you want to make it into a rhombus, you do this. You see? This is a rhombus, like this. So the upper right molar is going to be a rhombus this way, and the upper left molar is going to be a rhombus this way. So if you notice, this second molar here is sort of like this, the shape of a rhombus. So that's what we have to also do to the first molar. When we make the cusps, we will make this cusp, which is the mesial buccal, slightly more forward than the distal buccal, this one. And on the lingual, it's the opposite. You will make this one, the mesiolingual, a little bit distal, and this one, the distal lingual, a little bit more distal. So let's continue. So the first step here is we're going to build the cusp tip, and we're going to build it a little bit mesiolingual. I mean mesiobuccal. The distolingual cusp, we're gonna be also making it slightly more mesial. The distolingual cusp, we're gonna make that slightly distal, and the distolingual cusp, we're also going to make it slightly distal. When I mean distal, I mean more distal than the distal buccal cusp. You see? It's a little bit behind it. So it's gonna go like this. This is a rhombus. What we also have to note is that on the upper or maxillary arch, the lingual cusps are going to be slightly higher than the buccal cusps. So we'll have to line those up. Now if we look at them like this, we have to line up these cusps here. If you didn't learn about the curve of Spee, you will. The curve of Spee is basically a slight curve that happens when you line up all the cusp tips here. There's the slight curve. Depending on the patient, some people may have more exaggerated curves, some more flat curves. So these two cusps have to divide the tooth into 4 little slopes. So each cusp will have a little slope called the cusp ridge. So the cusp ridge basically will meet the distal. On this one, it's going to meet the distal buccal point angle on the second premolar. So that's what we're aiming for. The distal cusp ridge will go right in the middle of the tooth, and it will create a little triangle. So this is the cusp tip, this is the cusp ridge, and this is the cusp ridge. So this is the mesiobuccal cusp. So this is the mesial cusp ridge of the mesiobuccal cusp. This is the distal cusp ridge of the mesiobuccal cusp. So the next one, we're going to build the mesial cusp ridge of the distal buccal cusp. And then the distal cusp ridge of the distal buccal cusp will contact, or will come in close proximity of the mesial point angle of the second molar as such. So if you look at it, now you're starting to have something that looks like a cusp. So now we're going to move ahead and we're going to wax the mesial cusp ridge of the distal lingual cusp. The mesial cusp ridge of the mesiolingual cusp. And we're going to go to the distal lingual point angle of the second premolar. And remember, this cusp is going to be slightly higher than the buccal cusps. On the upper first molar, we have a ridge called the oblique ridge, which runs from the mesiolingual to the distal buccal. It's sort of like a smile. It goes around like this. And it stops right in the central fossa. A fossa is a depression in the tooth, and it's generally an area, it's not a point. Now we're going to join these 2 points together with a ridge called the marginal ridge. This is the mesial marginal ridge of the upper first molar. Or if you will, the upper left first molar. And then we try to make it flow together so that this ridge flows with the mesial cusp ridge of the mesiobuccal cusp and the mesial cusp ridge of the mesiolingual cusp. And we're going to do the same thing on the distal cusp, the distal lingual cusp, and we're going to do the distal marginal ridge. Now all the marginal ridges have to line up and they have to be at the same level. If you want to make sure this wax doesn't stick to the adjacent teeth, then what we can do is we can apply a little bit of a separator on these two teeth also, so that this wax doesn't stick to it. Now we can see that this cusp tip is a little bit on the low side, so I'm going to make it a little bit higher. So we basically have the framework of the occlusion, and this whole area here, we like to call it a fish mouth because it's rounded in shape and it looks like the mouth of a fish. You could also call it by a more technical name, which is the peripheral ridge right here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fill in this gap that we left here. And I'm going to take that off because I dropped it by accident. So we're going to fill in this hole. Okay, so let's look at it a little bit closer. We're going to fill this area in a little bit, so that when we start putting in the occlusal anatomy, they have an easier time. So now we look at these cusp tips. And if we notice, these cusp tips are a little bit far in, so we're going to bring them out. We want to make sure that these cusps are aligned with the second premolar and the second molar. The next step after the fish mouth, we will start waxing the buccal surface. Now the buccal surface is similar to the central incisor in the way that we have line angles and point angles on it. So here we're waxing the line angle, and as usual the occlusal surface, this time we're not calling it incisal, we're calling it occlusal because we have a flat, well not flat, but we have an occlusal area of the tooth, not an incisal area. The incisal delineates a line, and the occlusal is a surface basically. So the posterior teeth are also, they also have a wider area in the occlusal area here, and a narrower area which is by the gingival or the gum surface. So as we can see, we're going to wax all the way into the tooth with the line angle right down to the margin. Same thing on the distal. So we have the distal buccal line angle here. And we're going in from this area, and then it goes into the gum and to the margin. Then we shall fill up this central area of this lobe. The mesiobuccal lobe right here. And remember, the lobes, as they come together, they form a developmental groove. On the buccal of the molar, this developmental groove is called the buccal groove, which you will see in a little bit, will be formed where the two lobes come together. Now let's do the distal lobe. So we fill in this area now. Is the distal lobe. So as we can see, as we come closer and closer to the mesial lobe, it's starting to form a groove. Now, just like the incisor, this groove isn't too harsh, and generally after we fill up the gingival area of the tooth, the groove will stop at about 1/3 to halfway down the tooth. And with this groove we are going to also make it subtle. But it will be more of a groove than what we see on the facial or labial side of the incisor. So if we did a little bit too much heat in this spot, we can just make a little groove there. Since it's a developmental groove, they usually break through the peripheral ridge. Secondary grooves generally don't, but we're really not concerned with secondary grooves at this point in our project, since we're just going to try to do this molar without too much of a with excessive detail. We're just going to wax the most important areas. So after we did the buccal surface, we make sure we don't have any wax on the gingival area. So we kind of make it nice and neat here. You can take a look at it from the labial view and see how far out we are with the tooth. As we can see, we're a little bit far out here, so we'll take it back a little bit. And then we will move to the next part, which will be the lingual area. Okay, so the lingual area, now we take a look at it and we make sure that our cusp tips are aligned, which they pretty much are. And then we'll start waxing the lingual area. And we'll start with the line angles as before. Generally, the line angles on the lingual are not very apparent because the lingual areas of the molars are very rounded. But we could still use the reference to a line angle because this way we can specify the area of the tooth that we're talking about in case we're talking to a doctor or a colleague or something like that. So if we refer to the mesiolingual line angle of the molar, we would be talking about this area here. So this would be the mesiolingual lobe. This would be the distal lingual lobe that we're working on right now. Also, if you want to be more correct, you could refer to this area as the distal surface of the distal lingual cusp, or the distal surface or distal lingual surface of the distal lingual lobe. So as the two lobes come together again, this forms a developmental groove, and we can join that also together on the gingival portion, and then we have the groove here which fades out or stops like right about halfway down towards the gingival. And again, if we came over the gingiva, then we're going to take our instrument and carve it down after it cools down. If we do it too early, we're just going to crumble the wax. As we wait, we can refine the interproximals a little bit and open up this embrasure. Again, what is an embrasure? An embrasure is a V-shaped space that is formed by the two curvatures of adjacent teeth. And this could be on the occlusal, incisal, facial, buccal, or labial. If we can see the curvatures of the teeth, they come together into a space called an embrasure. Embrasure is usually V-shaped. In fact, no, it's always V-shaped. And they automatically form when you have two curved areas coming together. So here we're going to make this area nice and neat, and later on, after we remove the tooth, we can go into the interproximal areas and make those neat. As we make these curvatures on these teeth, we're forming the embrasures. This is the lingual embrasure. This is the occlusal embrasure right here. It's not too extreme, not too big. So if we look at it from here, you can see it come down the two curvatures right here. It's like a tiny little embrasure right on the occlusal, right there. Okay, so now we have the buccal surface here, and we have the lingual surface here. And in this area here, I feel that we should have a little more space because the shape of this tooth isn't quite like a rhombus. So we have to take this area here and kind of turn it so it faces more distally on the lingual. So to do that, we're going to increase the size of the embrasure here. And as I mentioned before, on the lingual surface of the first molar, we have the cusp of Carabelli. Which is right about here. If you notice, this one has a here also. Usually it meets up with the distal lingual developmental groove right here. And remember, this is a very slight protrusion from the lingual. And once we put this on, it will also further enhance our rhomboidal shape. You see? This came out a little bit more toward the distal. And let's make this distal lingual cusp a little bit rounder. We don't want to make it too flat. And this will also enhance our rhombus shape. As we see, we're creating that distal lingual groove. So the next step in this project is completing our occlusal surface. Okay, so the first piece of anatomy that we will put in there is the mesiobuccal triangular ridge. It is named because it looks like a triangle, and the wider part of the triangle is in the center of the tooth, which is the central fossa. It goes from the tip of the mesiobuccal cusp down towards the central fossa. And as I said, the bottom portion here is the wider part. So now we're going to put in the distal buccal triangular ridge, which also goes to the central fossa. The pointy area of the triangular ridge ends up at the cusp tip of the distal buccal cusp. The third ridge we're going to put in is the oblique ridge, which is mostly there already. We're just going to make it a little bit thicker right here, and it runs right into the distal buccal triangular ridge right here, and it forms a transverse ridge, meaning that it continues from the lingual to the buccal with a little bit of a division in the central groove. The central groove is formed by the lingual and the buccal lobes. Now the next ridge we put in is the mesiolingual triangular ridge, which also runs toward the central pit. Now if this happens where you actually melt the ridges together, You can always take an instrument and separate them. If you don't have a very sharp instrument, you can either buy one from Amazon or take one of your instruments and sharpen them so that you don't have such a problem with reaching into the occlusal area of the molar. See, we're separating the two cusps a little bit so that they look separate. Now the next cusp is a little cusp, and this triangular ridge is located right on the distal lingual cusp of the first molar, and this is pretty small, and it's created right there, the distal lingual area. Now we're going to just puddle in some of these areas, and just be careful not to overheat your instrument too much, because then you're gonna wash out all the little details you did. So I'm gonna put a little bit of wax on here and puddle it just like that. Same thing on the mesio buccal, just mesio buccal of the triangular ridge there. Put a tiny little bit of wax and kind of puddle it like that, and this will create a nice blended surface for those triangular ridges. Now we're going to do the same thing on the distal buccal cusp right here, just like that, and then the distal buccal part here, we're going to puddle that in a little bit. And then we're going to do it a little bit right here with the distal lingual cusp. This one is already pretty much puddled in. We're going to do that same thing here on the mesiolingual cusp, and now all we have to really do with the occlusal is to just separate the developmental grooves. So this is the central developmental groove right here, and it goes right through, and it goes to the groove that passes through the mesial marginal ridge, and you guessed it, this is called the mesial marginal groove. On the distal we have the same thing. The central groove goes and runs right into the distal marginal groove because it goes right through the distal marginal ridge. So this groove here, the central groove, divides the entire tooth into the two buccal, the buccal lobes right here, mesio-buccal lobe, distal buccal lobe. So the central grooves divides those from the lingual lobes, the distal lingual and the mesiolingual lobe. Now the groove that goes from the central groove and it breaks through the peripheral ridge through the buccal, that is called the buccal groove. Makes sense? Right here. Then you have another groove that runs straight from the central groove right here to the lingual, and this is the distal lingual groove, Or another name for it is the oblique groove, because it doesn't run straight through, but it runs from the distal buccal to the mesiolingual at a slight angle like this. So, and then we have the cusp of Carabelli, which is not really a cusp, it's more like a little protrusion. From the central groove, the groove that runs here, distal to the distal buccal marginal ridge, that is the distal buccal triangular groove, right here. And the mesial, this groove that runs from the central groove, runs mesial, the mesiobuccal triangular ridge, is called the mesiobuccal triangular groove, and it runs right here. Now if we take a look at the lingual portion, on the lingual portion we have the mesiolingual triangular groove. It runs from the central groove, mesial, the distal mesiolingual triangular ridge, and that's why it's called the mesiolingual triangular groove. This groove here is a secondary groove, and it separates the oblique ridge from the mesiolingual triangular ridge. We mentioned this one, oblique groove or distal lingual groove, and then we may or may not have a distal lingual triangular groove in this spot, because it's such a small cusp. This is such a small cusp that some people may not have a groove, but we're going to put it in just for informational purposes. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the occlusal surface and take a look at the grooves, at the shape of the teeth. If we notice here, this area is a little bit too bulbous, so we're going to reduce it a little bit, and this will also make us a little bit more rhomboidal in shape. Now if you notice here, the contact area is slightly U-shaped. We don't want that to happen, so we're going to open up the distal embrasure here so that we can make this groove run straight across. This marginal ridge and contact area run straight across. We don't want this curving because it can trap food and make the patient uncomfortable. And as you notice, there was a little bit too much wax here, and it was over the gingival, over the gingiva. So as soon as we removed that area, which was excess wax, this made it a lot straighter now. So we have more of a proper contact area, which we will also refine once we take this tooth out to refine the interproximals. So we pop this tooth out, and now we can see the rough areas that we couldn't get to. The margins are open here, so we'll have to add some wax, but we'll have to be careful not to add too much, because then the tooth will keep popping out of the model, since the model is made out of rubber. And this kind of lets us know whether we over contoured the tooth or not. So we fill in the gaps. As I said before, we don't overfill them. We just kind of complete the shape. Close the margins, but being careful not to put wax over the margins. If we put wax over the margins, we'll use our instrument and carve it back. Being careful to just fill the areas that are deficient. Sometimes the wax shrinks a little bit as it cools, so you may have to go over some areas. And now we wait for it to cool down. And then we can take our instrument and carve it back gently, making sure there's absolutely no wax on the margin. And kind of blend the surfaces together. And remember, there's contact areas to worry about, so you don't want to make it too tight or too loose. If it's a little loose, I'll show you a technique in a little bit that we can use to make a fairly accurate contact. And please don't pull the tooth off the die, because then it's going to keep falling off. The best way to use this video is to just continue in little parts. Don't try to do it all at once. If you want, you can watch it the first time all the way through, and then just divide it up for yourself into sections. And as you complete the different sections of the video, you can rewind or pause and continue slowly. There are too many steps to remember all at once. So we have this. Now we'll try it back in, and we're going to take a look at the different areas. You see this area here Looks like it's a little too deep, so we're going to add some wax there and kind of make it a little bit more flowing, and make the groove a little less extreme. So what I'll do is I'm going to heat up the instrument a little bit and then go in and puddle it in like so. And take the instrument and refine it a little bit, and then we should be done. So let's everybody try it out. Remember, use this, stop it in different sections wherever you feel comfortable, and just keep waxing it. It's waxed, so you can add to it, you can remove it, and if you have any questions, just ask me. So remember, the marginal ridges should be even with the adjacent teeth. You don't want these to be higher, the patient's going to be bothered. Like I mentioned before, if you don't have a good contact, what we'll do is we're going to heat up some wax and quickly put a little bit on this side and put a little bit on this side, both mesial and distal, and before it hardens, you just push it in between the teeth and you'll pretty much get a perfect contact every time. So let's go ahead and try it.